Breaking news now. Why a new international order is being pushed into motion by the conflict in Ukraine. Is the Ukraine a turning point for the world? If so, what repercussions would there be? Virtually every Western leader has claimed, since the conflict in Ukraine began, that this conflict represents a inflection point in world affairs. I think most of us can feel that. But exactly what does this imply, and how true is it? If so, what does this portend for the future? In the annals of modern history, such an event is rare. The fall of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires and the emergence of many new countries, among them the Soviet Union, make World War I a defining moment of the 20th century. In addition to decolonization, the European unification movement, and 70 years of global tensions during the Cold War, World War II must be included because it ushered in new institutions like the United Nations, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. Other dramatic moments that brought about significant change but perhaps not on the scale of the two world wars were the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Similarly, the 9/11 terrorist attacks on American soil had a far-reaching and long-lasting effect on U.S. national security policy and alliance relations, with some aspects of the former still in place more than 2 decades later. Is there some inflection point that everyone is talking about in relation to Ukraine? To begin with, there is the initial shock and astonishment. Most people, at least in the West, believed that a full-scale invasion of one major country by another in the heart of Europe was not supposed to happen again. Keep in mind that when U.S. intelligence predicted it, almost no one, including the Ukrainians, believed them. Russian skeptics who believed Putin's approach would be more cautious, stealthy, and incremental were therefore caught off guard by Putin's attack. Second, there are the widely discussed shifts that occurred in the wake of the war, such as the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO and the adoption of more assertive national security policies by Germany and Japan after 75 years of caution and restraint. The world is split between those who condemn Russia and those who, like China and India, are preoccupied with their own issues, blame both sides, or, like China, walk a fine line by condemning the violence but providing at least rhetorical support to Russia. Oil prices have also risen and food supplies have become scarce. That's sufficient evidence to conclude that the war is significantly altering global dynamics, possibly even more so than the 9/11 attacks. The sense that a major shift is imminent is also influenced by another important factor. For some time now, there has been a nagging worry that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is serious about forcibly integrating Taiwan into China in the near future, with all the attendant dilemmas this would pose for the US and Asian allies who have pledged to oppose this. The combination of the ongoing horror in Ukraine, the unknowable dread about Taiwan, and the shifting policies elsewhere raises a whole series of alarming what-ifs that add to the sense that we are on the cusp of a great transition. What if a series of unfortunate occurrences and blunders brings the United States and NATO closer to open conflict with Russia? If the United States is preoccupied with Russian aggression, what happens if Xi moves on Taiwan? What if that attracts Asian allies just as the Ukraine war starts to put a strain on European allies? Perhaps most importantly, what if, in the midst of all this, the United States undergoes a partisan-driven change of administration? That would mark a significant break in international relations, making the prospect of another global conflict more plausible. Of course, none of that can be predicted, and most experts would be hesitant to even call it probable. However, the vast majority of people would also agree that the odds are not nil. The belief that we are living through a defining moment in modern history is bolstered by this, hard-to-articulate, feeling of impending doom. What are the potential counter-reactions to the reactions we've seen so far? Is a crucial question to ask if you're wondering whether the Ukraine war will really upend things. When I think back on the times at the CIA when we were taken by surprise, and later accused of intelligence failure, I realize that the causes of those surprises often lay in small, imperceptible shifts. These are the subtle changes that are difficult to detect until a sufficient number of them have taken place. To put it another way, a shock, With that in mind, I'd like to draw your attention to two key components. The nuclear weapon threat assessment has been affected by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Although nuclear weapons have been a fixture in international politics since the Cold War, we haven't experienced any major nuclear scares in recent years. Putin's nuclear threats during the conflict, however, have made everyone re-evaluate the risks associated with such weapons. Nuclear war remains the worst possible scenario. The wider nuclear weapons are dispersed, the more likely this scenario becomes. Many nations have pointed out that Putin might not have gone to war if Ukraine had kept the nuclear weapons stationed on its soil after the fall of the USSR. Kyiv gave up 5,000 strategic and tactical nuclear weapons in 1994 under an agreement among Russia, Ukraine, and the US. To my knowledge, Ukraine has not taken any steps toward developing nuclear weapons as of yet. Some experts have dismissed such talk as dangerous nonsense, but a resolution to the conflict remains elusive. It is unlikely that Ukraine would not consider regaining a nuclear arsenal if the situation did not resolve in a way that gave the country complete confidence in its future security. Meanwhile, the situation in Ukraine is likely sparking policy discussions and worries about national security elsewhere. Saudi Arabia and other neighbors of Iran must face the fact that Tehran has achieved nuclear breakout. A senior Pentagon official said earlier this year that Iran was only 12 days away from having enough enriched material for a bomb. Further, in 2018, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stated unequivocally that Riyadh would follow suit if Tehran were to acquire nuclear weapons. At a time of great political uncertainty in the United States, and thus about Washington's fidelity to extended deterrence, that is, provision of its protective, nuclear umbrella, Japan and South Korea must be impressed that China is likely to more than triple its nuclear weapons force, to about 1,000, by 2030. The concern shown by our international partners over the current state of affairs in the United States and the potential impact this has on long-standing U.S. commitments is difficult to overstate. Secondly, the hardening of opposing alliances has the potential to introduce new currents of surprise into international affairs. On the American side, the strengthening of NATO is already apparent, while a parallel strengthening of ties with key Asian partners is only just becoming visible. Most recently, this was evident in a new tripartite security pact between the United States, South Korea, and Japan, in which the parties agreed to establish a crisis hotline and work more closely together on missile defense and in joint military exercises. Given the long history of mistrust and tension between South Korea and Japan, which dates back to World War II, this is truly remarkable. China has already criticized the pact, and I expect to see more joint military drills between China and Russia in the near future. The growing cooperation between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran in response to the conflict in Ukraine is reflective of a similar trend among the world's autocracies. Because of their shared opposition to U.S. global preeminence and the sanctioning power of the U.S. dollar, these four nations are increasingly cooperating across the board. Russia's arms trade with North Korea and Iran is the clearest example of their concrete cooperation. The United States claims that during the recent visit of the Russian defense minister, an arms deal was arranged during which North Korea supplied Moscow with rockets and artillery shells it needs in Ukraine, in direct defiance of unanimously adopted resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. Meanwhile, Iran has emerged as a major supplier of both missiles and unmanned aircraft. In exchange for oil and finished weapons, China is funding infrastructure projects in Iran and North Korea. The question of what Tehran and Pyongyang might want in exchange for such aid is a natural one to pose. The obvious exchange is Russia's assistance with both countries' nuclear and missile programs. Signs of Russian assistance to Iran's missile program have already been spotted, according to CIA Director William Burns. With Russian help, the Iranian missile program might be able to achieve the intercontinental range it has been seeking for years. In a nutshell, the tangible interests of these four autocratic countries have become more aligned due to the conflict in Ukraine. The longer the war continues, the more likely these are to become restrictive. The BRICS group of countries represents a third shifting global alignment.